Stay tuned, guys. Today we're going to learn how to use leather to make macrame jewelry. Hey guys, I'm Laura, and today we are going to be making a leather and tube bead macrame bracelet. I was learning this new type of macrame that lent itself really well to these tube beads that we have. These are stainless steel tube beads that have a really big hole, so I knew they would fit on leather, and I just thought that they would lay perfectly in this braid style. So I'm going to show you guys how to do it. First, we're going to go over the tools and supplies that we're going to need to make this project. First, we're going to need leather. This I'm using 1.5 millimeter to 2 millimeter leather. We're going to need tube beads and a large hole pearl for the clasp, flush cutter, a chain nose plier, some GS hypo cement glue, and our knotty do-it-all board. Before we get started, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about this knotty do-it-all board that I'm using for today's project. This is a wooden board that we use to lay our braiding and macrame projects and knotting projects out on. It's really great. It comes with this bag full of different pegs and clips that you can use to kind of stabilize your project while you're working. So I'm going to be using 2 of these clips in our project today. I'm not going to be using any pegs, but they're in there if you need them, and they have these large hole needles too. But this is a great way to measure your project while you're working, so that you don't have to pull your project off of a different work surface, measure it, put it back, and try to figure out how to get started again. So the first thing we're going to do is measure out our leather. This braid has a core in it that's 2 pieces of leather. So I'm going to measure about 15 inches. This is going to be too much, but I just like to have a little extra just in case. And then I'm going to fold it back on itself and cut right down there where that one meets it. And so this is going to be the core of our bracelet. And then I'm going to cut my working leather. So I'm going to cut about 2 arm lengths of leather, which ends up being about a total of 6 feet if you prefer to measure. And this is going to be the leather that we're working with. So we've got our core and we've got our working leather. I'm going to use my core leather to make the loop end of our clasp. We're going to make a pearl clasp. So I'm just going to fold, like I've got my leather folded in half, and right up here at the top I'm going to make an overhand knot and pull that loop through. And I just want to make sure before I pull my leather tight that I can fit one of these large hole pearls through that loop, and that looks like that fit pretty well. So I can go ahead and get this knot tightened up as good as possible. Give that a couple tugs. And then I'm going to use my chain nose pliers. I like to go into the loop with my chain nose pliers and open those pliers up to tighten from the loop end. That way I'm sure that my knot is really secure. So now I'm going to go down to the end of my core leather, and I'm just going to do a simple overhand knot. And this is just so that I can put a clip in front of this knot, and we'll be able to keep our leather tight on this board here. So I put a clip at the 0 point, that way I can measure out my bracelet while I'm working. So I'm going to clip my loop here clip my loop in there, and then I'm going to pull this leather taut and grab it with my clamp, and I'm just going to press it down into whichever hole I can get it in that will keep this cord nice and tight. And now we're going to move on to our working cord. And this is what we're going to be using to make our knots. This is what we're going to be putting our beads on. It's going to do nothing but hold the leather and our beads. So I'm going to pull this in, or fold it in half on itself, and I'm going to start at the halfway point. And I'm going to show you guys how to do this braid a couple times before we add any beads for 2 reasons. One, so that you can really get a good handle on how to do this braid without kind of the beads interfering with what you can see. And then also I like to leave a little bit of space between my clasp and the start of my beads. That way, when you're trying to put your clasp on, you don't have a lot of bulk right there that makes it harder to get your fingers in there and get your clasp on. So we're gonna do a couple rounds of this braid without our beads on. So I've got my leather at the halfway point, and I'm gonna bring it behind my core leather, and I've got one on the left and one on the right. And so the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull my left leather over my core and make a loop like that. Then I'm gonna pull my right hand leather across all of my cords, like diagonal, over to the left hand side, and it's gonna go around the bottom and up through that loop that I just made. So then I'm gonna pull everything tight. And now we've got that nice X shape right there. And then I'm gonna do that again. So I'm going to pull my left hand cord across my core and make that loop. Then I'm gonna pull my right hand cord diagonal across my core and across my other cord, down around the bottom and up through the loop. Pull that nice and tight. And this you can really tell if you've got it, if you've got a good knot. It's got a lot going on, so you can tell really easily if you need to go back and do your knot again, because it gets really bulky really fast if you're doing your knot wrong. And you're gonna want these pieces, these crossover pieces, to lay like really nicely next to each other. We're gonna kind of make like half of a chevron or a fishtail with the leather that goes diagonal over our core. So that's one way to measure whether you're doing it right, is if these cords nestle next to each other in a good diagonal shape. So I'm gonna do a couple more passes without my beads. So I'm basically making an S shape across my core, and I want to make sure I'm going across the core and then back to the left hand side. And then I'm going to take my right hand cord and go diagonal across all of my cords and around through the bottom and then up through that loop that I made. Get this pulled nice and tight. And now I think we're ready to start adding our beads. So one thing that I like to do is get all of my beads strung before I start knotting. That way I can get into a groove and get going quickly without having to stop and add more beads. And for me, that's a great way to streamline any project that I'm doing, is to do repetitive things all at once if I can. It minimizes how many times you're picking up and putting down tools, how many times you're trying to find out where you are in your project, and it really cuts more time than we would think. So I cut my cord, my leather on the diagonal. That just makes it easier to string it. Sometimes when you cut your leather, it kind of smushes the end of it, and then it can flare out and be hard to get into your bead. But if you cut it at an angle, it's got a nice point to get into that bead really easily. So I'm just gonna string some of my beads on here, and they go on here like perfectly. I swear these were like made for this leather. They're a perfect fit. All right, so let me just tell you where these beads need to go. You need to make sure that you're stringing them on your right hand cord, this cord right here, because this is the cord that makes the diagonal, and you want your bead to be the diagonal. So you want to make sure all your beads are going on this right hand cord right here. I'm just gonna keep stringing. And this project actually requires quite a bit of these tube beads because they'll be laying diagonally, so they're not taking up as much space down the bracelet, or they're taking up less space as you go down the bracelet. So you're gonna need more than if they were like running parallel to the core of your bracelet. I'm just gonna string a whole bunch, and I'll probably string more than I need. But the great thing about this board is that it measures while you're braiding. So you know, and we're gonna stop our braid at like, so if I wanna make an 8-inch bracelet, I'm gonna stop my braid at 7.5 because I've still gotta add my pearl for the other side of my clasp. So you'll start to see whether or not you've got enough beads strung once you get closer down to that mark. But I like to go ahead and string probably more than I need just so that I don't have to worry about it. All right, so I've got my beads strung and I'm just gonna make a simple overhand knot down here on the end of this cord that I strung my beads on so they don't fall off. And then I'm ready to start braiding with my beads. So I'm gonna pull a bead up here all the way up to my bracelet. And then we're gonna do that same technique. We're just gonna keep that bead pushed up there while we're doing it. So I'm gonna make this crisscross S shape over my cord. I'm gonna come across with my leather that has the bead on it, up through the bottom and through this loop. And then I'm gonna pull everything tight, trying to keep that bead on the diagonal right there. So get that pulled nice and tight. And see how that bead just lines right up with those other diagonal cords. So we're going to pull another bead down. Do the same thing. Make your S shape. Pull this the right hand cord diagonal across all your beads, around the bottom and up through that loop. Then we're going to pull everything tight. And we just want to make sure that these beads are nestling up next to each other, and that's how we know we're doing our braid right. Another bead. We're going to make our S shape, come across diagonally with our right hand cord around the bottom and up through this loop. And we're going to pull everything tight and make sure those are nestling perfectly. And so I'm going to continue to do this braid all the way down my bracelet. You can make whatever size you want. Just make sure that you leave space for your clasp. So your clasp is going to take up about 1/2 inch. So you want to stop your braid about 1/2 inch before what you want the final length of your bracelet to be. All right, so I'm just going to do a couple passes again without any beads, and then we're going to add our clasp. I'm going to make my S shape, come across with my cord and up through the bottom, through this loop, pull everything nice and tight. And once you get comfortable with this braid, it gets a lot, you can kind of figure out what works for your hands. And so it ends up, the way you braid ends up looking a little bit different than the way it looked when you learned. But once it goes a lot faster once you start getting used to the braid and get more comfortable doing it. All right, I think I've got enough braided there that I'm ready to add my clasp. I've got it right at the 6.5 because like I said, I'm going to make a 7-inch bracelet. So I'm going to end it right here at the 6.5, and then I'm going to add my pearl to make my clasp. All right, so I'm going to cut my leather, my working leather off. And this is where we're going to use our hypo cement and just dab some hypo cement down around the base of these cords, and that'll keep them from coming undone once we cut them off. There we go. And now I'm ready to cut my cords off. So I'm going to snip them down as close as I can get them to my braid so that they're not kind of distracting from the overall look of the piece. So I just want them to be flush with my braid. And now I'm ready to add my pearl. I'm only going to be able to fit one piece of leather through my pearl. So I'm going to have to cut off one of my core pieces too, which is fine. So I'm going to again put some hypo cement down in there before I cut this guy off, so that I'm not worried about my core leather going anywhere because it's got so many braids wrapped around it. But I just want some extra security, so I'm going to put a little dab of glue in there. And then I'm going to cut that piece off, again, right down by my knot so that it's nice and flush. Cut this knot off here at the bottom too. And then I'm going to pick a pearl. I like to go for, when I'm making a pearl clasp, I like to use a bigger pearl, and obviously one that has a big hole in it. But you want one that's substantial enough that you can grab a hold of it and put your bracelet on by yourself without having to have someone do it for you. So then I'm just going to make an overhand knot right here at the base of my pearl. I want to give myself a little wiggle room. I'm not going to pull it super tight, because when I loop it back through the loop we made on the other end, I want that loop to have somewhere to nestle in. And so if I get this too tight, then my cord can't nestle in there and like stay clasped securely. So again, I'm gonna use my glue around the base of this cord, around this knot. And then I'm just gonna cut that piece off. Right down there at the knot, like that. So then we're just going to bring this around and push this pearl through the loop that we made, and that's our clasp. And that's why I said to leave yourself a little bit of room between your pearl and the end of your braid, so that your loop has somewhere to catch when you put it on, and that way it's going to stay clasped and it's not going to pull off over your bead while you're wearing it. And that's all there is to this bracelet. All right, so let's go over one more time the tools and supplies that you're going to need to do this project. First, we're going to need our leather. I'm using 1.5 to 2 millimeter leather. Then we're going to need our tube beads and a large hole pearl for the clasp. We're going to need a flush cutter, a chain nose plier, some GS Hypo Cement glue, and our Naughty Do-It-All board. If you want to grab any of the materials and supplies that I used for this project, check out the links in the description below. And if you guys have any leather projects that you want to see us do, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you don't miss any future projects. Thanks for watching.